Hello, and thank you for joining us for the Truth Project podcast. This is a show about truth, meaning, purpose, and trying to make sense of the world we live in. The show is intended to be listened to chronologically, starting with episode 1. So if you haven't yet listened to episode 1, please go back and start there. We hope you enjoy the journey.
Hello, Alec.
Good morning, Warren. How are you today?
Doing well. How about yourself?
Doing great. Thank you. Yep, it's a beautiful day. Glad to have you here and excited to continue our conversational journey together.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Well, first, I'd like to revisit the content of last episode, do my best to kind of summarize and restate what I believe transpired in the conversation, and I'm going to give you a chance to correct or elaborate on any of those points to really solidify that and give us kind of a launching point for today's episode. Does that sound good to you?
Very well.
Great. Well, overall, the episode last time, you talked about Aristotle and his, I guess you call deduction of unmoved mover, or first cause. I don't know if that's his term, but he saw grass swaying, and he said, well, it's not the grass that's choosing to do that. There's a force that's acting on it, cause and effect, and that's the wind. But then, we can ask, well, what causes the wind, and what causes the cause that causes the wind? And ultimately, rolling backwards all the way to the very beginning, Aristotle deduced that there has to be an unmoved mover, in his words, and that's you described, I believe, as an uncaused cause potentially, or something similar to that. Uncaused causer, it's the same thing as unmoved mover. And so that's, a level of indeterminacy. And I think, maybe one way we can describe that as where cause and effect are no longer in this operating under the same rules, or just are not, as we understand here in this reality, which you described as the mesocosm, between the micro and the macro, which was a term I had never heard before, and I think is a really important term, especially in light of this conversation. So we have on the macro side indeterminacy, a point at which cause and effect is not the same as it is here in the mesocosm. Then also we talked about quite a bit of history of science. You talked about Democritus as basically philosophically, deducing that on the micro level, there is some point of indeterminacy as well. He coined the term atom, which means cannot be divided, I believe literally, and that's actually the same word that's used to describe an atom today, and to discovered 200 years ago, roughly, where Democritus really figured this concept out in his mind, over 2,000 years ago. And so essentially we have now, indeterminacy at a micro level, indeterminacy at a macro level. And I think kind of the biggest point that we got to in that was that, what we focused on kind of primarily at the end of the conversation, was the idea of this quantum physics in the 20th century latching on to this micro indeterminacy, or uncertainty is I think word quantum physicists will use often. And that idea became fuel, and people took that idea of micro uncertainty and then applied that loosely to our mesocosm, the reality we live in, and basically implying that everything is indeterminate, nothing is certain, because at the deepest level, the smallest level, there's nothing particular there. There's nothing definite. That means nothing can be known, nothing can be true, in a sense, was the implication. And of course, postmodernists probably delighted in this and said, yes, see, scientific proof. It sounds like physicists said, yes, we've proven that nothing can be known, essentially, which, as we've discussed, is a great contradiction in itself. And it sounds like that has had really a profound impact. We really started the episode with the idea of what is the impact of postmodernism being, preached in the universities on the world. And so we got deeper into that and how these ideas have penetrated the academic sphere, and how that has played out. And as you've mentioned, you've had hundreds of students and probably colleagues and such say, look, quantum physics proves nothing's real, nothing's certain. And I really think your point is, yes, at the micro level, but this principle is being misapplied into the reality we live in today. And there is certainty, and we can know that. I can leave my car keys in the drawer, and I can, go out on a walk, and I come home and my keys are still in the drawer, assuming my wife hasn't moved them or something like that. But, we don't live in the quantum world where things are probabilistic. And maybe my keys will be in the drawer. There's the best chance they'll be in the drawer, but there's a lot of other chances that they could be, in India or on the moon or buried in the ground, or maybe even have just dissolved. And so, that idea has been, misapplied. And I think you said it's one of the great injustices of the 20th century, intellectually. And essentially, we need to really recapture that. And I think your point was we need to teach this in middle school. And I'd love to know kind of what your thoughts are on, what's the best way to teach that. And in some senses, it's, maybe not talking about quantum physics, but, just making it clear that we live in a world where things are predictable. And I think another important point is there are a really critical point. There are things that are real that we've discovered through science and mathematics. And I think you made a point, discovered is a key word, not invented or created. And, 1 + 1 = 2 in this reality. And if that changes, things are unpredictable, but it doesn't change. And there are several, laws of nature. Mathematical laws are maybe one of the easiest to, discuss. But, I think, gravity, there's tons of other things I'm sure you could dive into more. So that's kind of my understanding of what transpired last episode. Love to hear your feedback, thoughts, any corrections to what I'm saying, clarifications, and anything you think's worth elaborating on at this point.
Well, without a doubt, not to sound too pedantic, but that'd be an A+ in my classrooms for someone to summarize last class. A couple of small things that have got mixed up, but we didn't get into them that deep, and maybe we don't want to. We would enter nerdland for sure into epistemology, namely when you say that in the mesocosm there is certainty. Okay, but not about your keys. Okay, that's a probability. That's called induction, not deduction. The physical sciences work entirely on induction. Okay, if my premises in an argument are made up in part or just altogether by observations, the 5 physical senses, that all the knowledge that derives from that kind of a method is probabilistic only. Okay? So me dropping this handkerchief and it falling down, that's not a certainty. Okay? That's a very high probability. That's what that is. That's the expectation. That's what knowledge can render. When I get into the quantum levels, that's where you applied probable. Not necessarily. When we talk about leaving cause and effect behind, traditional sense of a Newtonian universe, the first law of thermodynamics, which is what you leave behind when you go into some aspects of quantum physics, right? Then it's not a distinction between probability and certainty. It's just that things don't work the way we do in the mesocosm by cause and effect. Okay? So, so yes, just a little bit there. If we want to tie into that now, we're already getting a little deep into that. The probability function of empirical sciences has to do with the correspondence method in the mesocosm, and certainty can only be had by deductive inferential laws, which happen by the coherence method, and we spoke of that. So you have mathematics and formal logic. That'll give you certainty. The only certainties science knows of in the human condition. You get into the physical sciences, we're always talking about probabilities. That's what that is, all of it. But very high probabilities at times. You'd be a fool not to take note. I mean, I don't know if one day I may put my hand on a red hot burner and it doesn't burn me. Okay? But, given I do believe that 99.9999999% of the time that's going to happen, it's good enough reason not to do it. Okay, we cannot know that one day I let go of this and it goes up. Again, these are huge probabilities that it'll go down. Okay. So empirically, we don't have certainties, we have high probabilities. They allow us, these high probabilities allow us, okay, to build a World Wide Web, to go skip and dance on the moon, to do brain surgery and all this kind of stuff. That's all you need is high probabilities.
Okay.
You're just comparing bell curves and saying, well, that makes a lot more sense. Overall, makes a lot more sense. And then in formal logic, in much of philosophy and in mathematics, that's where you run face to face into certainties through the inferential laws of deduction. Now, to get out of the deeper level, I mean, this is formal epistemology and all that kind of stuff, which is important, but now you're into philosophy proper, studying it, the nuts and bolts, and perhaps outside the context of what is a conversation, just on basic idea of truth versus confusion. I will tie this one into what your summary gave us. You speak of the mesocosm, and that is important, okay? That is important. I encourage you to consider, perhaps, what has been useful to me in my work, and I've conveyed this last time. I call the mesocosm our human condition. That's the term I use for the world we live in. And what is that? Formally, it's the mesocosm, yes, that which is in between the macro and the micro. But in reality, to be more poignant, more illustrative, more expressive, what it actually is our human condition. That's what that is.
Can you explain a little more what you mean by like our human condition? Does that you mean like just this what we deal with, what we're in, what we experience?
Sure. Yeah. All right. Let's do it this way. There's a nice term that's come about in the 1700s. It's very important. Okay. The 20th century has been unkind. Okay. And the dismissiveness towards older insights into philosophy is tragic. Okay. Let's say you and I go hiking, Alex. And here where I am, there's true wilderness. That's why I'm here. I like true wilderness. Okay, there's bears, there's lions, there's wolverines, wolves. I mean, it's a official wilderness designated area. Preservation, surrounded by the Bighorn National Forest, conservation. So it's beautiful. You can only enter in on foot or on horseback. Legally, you're even supposed to pack your poop out. There's species of fish and trout, subspecies up here that exist nowhere else, all that kind of stuff. I seek valleys here when I go a week or 10 days, just me and my dogs, and my frame pack, disappear into the wilderness. I seek out larger ravines or small valleys where there genuinely is no one. I'm the only human being at that point in time wandering into it. There's no one there. Okay? There's truly no one else there. There I have this exhilarating sense, to me at least. I'm just a little boy. I'm just a country boy, okay? This exhilarating sense that surely there are square yards that I may step on or traverse in my going through. There's no path there. Perhaps a wildlife trail occasionally, but there's no trails or anything like that. So I'm off-trail wilderness hiking. And it's exhilarating to me to realize that surely there are square yards that I traverse or step on that no human being has ever touched in the history of the world. That makes me happy. Okay, that's just me. It's just like, wow. Now imagine you go with me, okay? And we are in such a valley. We look at it and it's like, wow, a waterfall over here, a river, just the landscape, the trees everywhere. I mean, Smokey the Bear galore. It's like, wow, there's elk, there's everything. So you and I are sitting there going, wow, this is great. And then we decide, so this is the valley. We're in here just enjoying it. Then we decide it's time to go home. So you and I walk up to the ridge and hike on out. A few days later, we're out of the wilderness. Okay. All right? Mm-hmm. How does that valley look, Alex? How does that valley look like? Tell me. Tell me how that valley looks. Or here's a bunch of paint. Here's a piece of paper. Whatever. Show me how that valley looks. Okay? And you're going to put, there's green trees everywhere and rock formations, and I heard the sound of the birds and the blue sky and the sun coming through, and that's the reality of that valley. That's how it looks. No later than the 17th century, we realized that's called naive realism. That's what that's called. Naive realism. It implies the idea that these things are windows, which, and to be sure, they are not. Okay? In other words, the reality is you have no clue how that valley looks like in and of itself. All you know is what your 5 physical senses allowed through into your mind and imagination thereof, your perception. Yet we know in the animal kingdom that there are many, many animals that have senses that are totally alien to our 5 senses. Okay, I mean, you got bats flying around in a total dark room where they are blind and they'll never hit that chair. Okay, they got sonar coming out of their head. I mean, they obviously perceive the furniture in the room in cave darkness. They understand. I have no idea what that is. I don't have one of them senses. Clearly, that room looks different to them than it does to me. So all you're giving me is not the picture of how that valley looks in reality. No, you're giving me the picture of how that valley looks in your head, and you're never able to leave that place. You cannot venture in front of these things to see how the world in front of our eyeballs looks in and of itself. You can only describe it from behind these things. And that's different from what a window does, if you will. In a window, it doesn't make that distinction. I mean, I'm still looking behind. There are sharks. They have these little dots on their face. Apparently, they can, a mile away, sense electromagnetic, minute impulses like anxiety in an organism hundreds of yards away. They pick that up, like neural energy or something. They can pick that up. Oh, wow. Something over there might be wounded, or, oh, yeah, let's go get it. Lunch. Imagine I added another unique sense to the 5 you already have that is different than any one of the 5 you already have. What that would mean is when we come home from the valley and I say, here, paint, show me how it looks, that picture now would be different. So it's not true to say, I'm going to paint this and that's how the valley looks. No, that's how the picture of the valley in your head looks. Because the reality of the valley, you don't know how that looks. And even that picture changes if I mess with your senses. Let's say I take one of your senses away, so you only have 4. Again, the picture that you'll paint changes. So we have this picture of this great, beautiful blue ball called planet Earth. And that's continents and the clouds and all this. Now imagine there's no humans on planet Earth. Paint me planet Earth without humans on it. You paint this big blue ball with the white clouds. No. If there's no humans on it, then that picture doesn't apply to the reality of how planet Earth looks in and of itself. We can say nothing about how the world in front of our eyeballs looks in and of itself. We can say nothing about that. In order for me to know that, I would theoretically have to have literally infinite senses, not an indeterminate amount of senses, not 99.999999999, not a Google senses, infinite senses. Only then could I claim to know how the world looks in and of itself. And that's clearly outside our human condition. The whole idea of infinite sense, now we're talking in categories like unmoved mover. Does that make sense so far?
I think so. Let me kind of restate what I think you're saying and maybe ask a couple questions. So, human condition, we have a limited perception of what reality really is. And, we think, we experience things in a way where they seem real, and we think, well, I see my computer screen here and I know what that is. It's some plastic and things like that. And, I can tap on it. Okay, there it is. It's solid. And I think I think I understand. And there's a lot more things that exist, which is evidenced by, like you mentioned, sonar, that a bat has. There are, there are different, many different frequencies, and I don't know how to
non-visible light.
Non-visible
You
light.
speak of the blue sky and the green trees. There's so much more color going on that is, we are only perceiving this much out of a spectrum that big. And that's all there in the reality of the valley, but we're not aware of it.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe an interesting thing to talk about, maybe it's relevant, dark energy, dark matter. I don't understand it. Well, maybe no one really does. I don't know. Apparently makes up maybe the majority of of energy. And so I guess, one thing that I wanted to kind of mention in kind of recapping here is, I think, maybe some of this relates back to this kind of quantum, physics conversation. And, I think, so I watched a video, years ago, before I had, was in class with you, and I'm guessing you're familiar with it. It's called What the Bleep Do We Know? And it's really in this vein of pop physics, quantum physics, and really kind of drawing what I believe now to be some inaccurate conclusions. Maybe not all of them, but one thing that I got out of it that I think is important, and you can verify if this is correct, but essentially, what we consider to be real solid material, this microphone, is primarily actually empty space. And in terms of being what we would consider solid particles, it's mostly empty space and things revolving around. So
Let me let me let me finish the thought here, and you tell me what
okay,
you think. Okay.
okay,
So we can establish deductively, okay, that whatever picture of the valley you want to offer me, that's the picture of the valley that receives what was received in your head. It doesn't reflect the valley as it is in and of itself. It's lacking substantially. Just think of all the non-visible light on the spectrums and all this stuff. See what I'm saying? So here's some nomenclature that is used to this day. This is where people often philosophy is so misunderstood. Okay, I mean it's the very foundation, the very basis of science, and it's often the 20th century, last 120 years have made it into some old dudes in togas sitting around opinionating, as opposed to the rigor that inheres in it in scientific thought. But scientists the world over, unknowingly, in many ways, still use the verbiage because it's so determined by philosophical insight. So, for example, there is the world as it is in and of itself. There is a valley out there. Okay? And how it looks in and of itself, I don't know. I know how it looks through 5 particular filters. Right? So I have the world as it is in and of itself. And I have the human being with his sense apparatus, my 5 senses and a mind. Let's call it the human mind. And when those two bump into each other, the result of that interaction is what we call the phenomenal world. And that is the world we mistake for reality. In other words, yeah, that valley was beautiful, and you and I agree on how it looked, but how it looked is the phenomenon of that valley, not the valley in and of itself. And so the world in and of itself, the human mind, they touch and interact. The result of that interaction is the world we find in front of our eyeballs, which is the phenomenal world of observation. Naive realism is the mistake of thinking that the phenomenal is the world in and of itself. It's not. It's how our mind interprets the world in and of itself. And ever since we've come to understand this insight, you will always read in scientific journals, physicists, when they write, we did this experiment, here's the hypothesis, blah, blah, blah. And then in the abstract, it'll say, when it refers to the results, the phenomena observed was. Because that's all it is. We can make, in the physical sciences, we can define knowledge as high probabilities of the statistical analysis of the phenomena observed. There's regularities in the phenomena observed. Okay? So you can give me a phenomenal picture of the valley. Yes. That is understood as the product of the valley as it is in and of itself, and you perceiving it, apprehending it, imagining it through your 5 filters. That's the phenomenal picture. That's the big blue ball without humans in it. That's the phenomenal imagination. But if there's no humans down there, well then, it's not going to look like that in and of itself. Okay? So the phenomenal world is our human condition. You see, that's the mesocosm. That's what makes it human. That's what makes it human. The phenomenal world of cave darkness is that I am blind and I run into a wall and say, ouch, that hurts. That bat is experiencing a different phenomenal world. It does not hit the walls, even though it is just as blind in eyesight as I am. Okay? To it, if we can even speak that far, but anyway, to it, it's a different phenomenon. It's experiencing a different phenomenal world. And so our human condition is the phenomenal world. So everything you think of, the sun rising, the Milky Way at night, the valley hiking with Warren, that's phenomenon. And we walk around in it. All of the world in front of our eyeballs is the phenomenal world. Okay. It is as we experience it, as we, let's say, see it, it is not independent of us seeing it. But it's not a figment of our imagination. There is something out there, the world as it is in and of itself. And thereupon there are regularities, natural laws, order that even allows for science, that allows us to understand truth, truthfulness, knowledge. And so that's the human condition. Just to advance deeper into this word mesocosm, it's our human condition that I have these 5 particular senses. The world I see in front of my eyeball is not independent. It would look different if I had different than these 5 senses. What does that mean? It means these things are not the way we typically think of as a window. The window, we think of, I'm looking at something outside in front of the window as it really is. And this then leads really up into, we're getting into nerdland again. This leads into, one of the highlights, one of the few highlights in my field, philosophy of the 20th century, which is Edmund Husserl and the philosophy of phenomenology. Okay? Wonderful, wonderful. In the 20th century, a highlight of someone sincerely trying to make sense instead of imposters running around with agendas, political and otherwise. And just to throw this out there for you and your viewers, what makes philosophy, in my humble opinion, unique as a field, I mean, there's many things. One that stands out to me, it is not singularly a progressive field. Okay, the physical sciences are just that. Okay, knowledge progresses in a very certain and cumulative way. 2 steps up, 1 step down. 2 steps up, 1 step down. Okay? It goes onward and upward. Philosophy transcends that. There are aspects of philosophy that do that, but there are others that go deeper yet where that can't be said. So there's this, what I'm trying to get at is there is this misconception in many folks when they hear the word philosophy that, 17th century philosophers knew a whole bunch that 14th century philosophers just didn't know. And so they were all wrong. Or like in the 20th century, it's become really, really vogue, almost fashionable. Like, for example, the analytic school of philosophy, to say that, oh, well, here's an argument that negates the entire 2,500 history of philosophy, and therefore now we can say this and just erase all of that and move on from here. That was very fashionable in different traditions of the 20th century. And to think there's no wisdom to be gleaned for a human being to study René Descartes or Immanuel Kant or Leibniz or Francis Bacon is the ultimate hubris, the ultimate arrogance. I mean, it may change your life to understand Aristotle, to understand Plato. That's not superfluous, gone, meaningless because we've moved on. I mean, yeah, in chemistry it is. If we talk about alchemy of the 12th century, we can, we kind of left that behind, perhaps for good reason. What do I know? I'm not a chemist in that sense, but, there's a sense in biology that, Lamarck was wrong. I don't know if you know Lamarck, but, during the Cold War in the Soviet Union, all the way through, up and through the 1980s, the universities in Russia taught Lamarckian evolution, which is a denial of Darwinism. And Lamarck taught that, some animals depended on the leaves on the trees to eat on the savanna of Africa. And when they were plentiful, the animals, then there were too little leaves, right? And so they had to keep stretching their neck. And if they stretch over a lifetime, well, then their offspring is grown with a little bit of a longer neck. And if they have to stretch and stretch, then because them stretching all the time, their offspring will have a little longer neck, and that's how you explain a giraffe. Okay, which is very different than natural selection, genetic mutation, the whole Darwinian thing. I mean, the two stand in opposite views. Lamarck was a biologist, and Charles Darwin was a biologist. And Lamarck was plainly shown to be wrong by any sense of scientific knowledge. And the joke back then when I was a teenager is that in communism land, they demanded to still teach it. Because, it wasn't Darwin, that's what the West is doing. Now, there's problems with Darwin too. I'm not defending Darwin. I mean, there's real problematic things everywhere. And then they're being addressed by contemporary evolutionary giants of mind. Brett Weinstein comes to mind here. I mean, he's solid scientific mind when it comes to this kind of stuff. But it's field specific, right? His wife, Heather. But anyway, Yeah, a little segue there to Lamarck. Didn't know how we got off on that. Where were we?
Um, yeah, we were going deep. Talk about phenomenology and philosophy as being a different type of
Oh,
science,
there we
whereas
go. See,
natural
we were,
science
we
is
were
building
there. We
models.
were there. Biology, nowadays, a biologist worth his salt will have a smirk on his face when he hears about Lamarck. Okay? I mean, there was a guy, he was just plain wrong. You see that? You see that? Okay, and so they've moved, it's a progressive science, the physical science. It progresses on each other. Like nowadays, we genuinely do more. We know more than a biologist knew 100, 200, 300 years ago.
Yeah, has to build and grow kind of by definition, but
Philosophy does not necessarily. In some senses, it's that way, but in others, it is not. Not at all. Okay, and it's just too often that I meet students and especially colleagues in different fields, be it economics or whatever, that, that just don't understand that. They only have a superfluous understanding of philosophy or a surface level. And in there, especially my experience of the 20th century, it's often like, yeah, well, no one needs to read that anymore because we know better now. Really? Really? I mean, you're treating it like a physical, it makes no sense whatsoever. It makes no sense whatsoever. Okay, there are truths that have been spoken, insights that have been correctly described about what we call reality hundreds of years ago that are stand in denial to this day because it conflicts with particular agendas of this here world. And so it's a blessing to step into philosophy anywhere in that river. It's not just happening at this point in time where the water is gushing out of the past. You can step into it 2,000 years ago and learn enormous things about your present human condition.
in in some ways, I think maybe this relates. Philosophy. I mean, could theoretically a philosopher from 2,000 years ago could have access to basically all of the same? They could come up, to do the same things that someone today could. It doesn't rely on this building. So, I mean, is that relevant, or would you say that's true? A
We saw that
philosopher.
last time with the atom. I
Hmm.
trust perhaps you Googled some of the stuff, Democritus, atom, like, wow, they really did talk about that 2,500 years ago. Amazing, stuff like that. Yeah, but deeper still, at some point, we're not going to get around speaking of what is knowledge, Alex, and we want to tie it into our conversation. What is knowledge? Let me give you an example. I mean, we have artificial intelligence now being on the radar, artificial general intelligence being on the radar, possibility in the near future of artificial superintelligence. And to my mind, there could never have been such a lull in understanding that has little to do with what it's about in terms of being human. We have this naive sense of, well, humans somehow are different than other animals because we're more intelligent. The end. Wow. Now, right there, that's intellectual bankruptcy. That's just, that's a knife through the heart. What the heck? Why do I say that? Well, it's my understanding. I once followed along in the 80s. They did a study out of Chicago where they assigned Webster intelligence scale points, 100 being the average, to historical figures. Okay, like John Stuart Mill was placed at 200 out of 200. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. And Hitler came in at 142. I mean, that's almost 3 standard deviations above the above the mean. So, really, needless to say, Hitler was a very smart, very intelligent man. That should go without saying if you're gonna rise to be the orchestrator of world history, for better or for worse. You're certainly gonna have to have some wits about you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I started as an undergraduate in my psychology studies questioning this and have never stopped. What does that tell me about intelligence? I mean, the most evil person in the world's history can be a super intelligent guy. Why do we make this so overly important? What we can understand is there's no correlation between intelligence and virtue. Being a virtuous human being, being a good human being, being a meaningful human being. There's no correlation. Heck, Bundy, the serial killer, is above average intelligence. So intelligence singularly lends itself, apparently, there seems to be a correlation to power, to idols, as religious people would call it, money, power. They're like the sophists, right? Teach you to be a real good orator, rhetoric, and amass power, social status. There seems to be a correlation with intelligence. Okay, to put it bluntly, a dummy isn't going to rise to have the country vote them in as a president. I mean, you might be uncouth, you might be many things, but you ain't going to be a dummy. Okay, yeah. Well, what does that have to do with know thyself, as Socrates commanded mankind to do? Self-knowledge, knowing my place, knowing good from bad. And the hypocrisy here is enormous. People are hypercritical. For example, why do we want? I see this all the time. They interview these AI guys around the world, nowadays especially. They're like, oh, who knows, bad. It's like, okay, I understand we may very well be in the process right now of creating a world that no one wants. How stupid is that? So these guys talk and say, well, the benefits are so great. The benefits are so great. Well, explain that. What do you mean the benefits are so great? Well, it might solve this, it might solve that, energy, blah, 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 blah. Those are normative value judgments, Alex. That's them saying those benefits make the world better. What does that mean? It means those benefits bring more good into the world. Yet there's no correlation between intelligence and goodness. Adolf Hitler, a very intelligent man. Ted Bundy, very intelligent man. kill people in their sleep, bludgeon them to death, because it's a fun thing to do on a Saturday night. So you're saying it brings more good in the world. How so? There's a disconnect. Okay, intelligence is not the main feature of what makes us human. Being rational beings is but a means to an end. Intelligence is but a means to an end. And that end will forever beckon of value, a value judgment, that which is empirically not apprehendable in terms of I can't weigh virtue and goodness. I can't measure it. I can't put it on the table. Okay? And self-knowledge ultimately allows one to develop towards well-being in every aspect. And the knowledge thereof of well-being. And so this whole idea that is present in 20th century empirical physical sciences, that somehow they are the only ones who get to say what is to be considered real, is so ridiculous it's beyond words. In other words, yeah, no, there's no real knowledge in them theologians, those poets, and them, and them, and them. And nothing could be further from the truth. Aristotle himself understood the very purpose of the academia, the academy, the universal school of higher learning, to be that of character development. Character development. Ever more light, by the way of reason, even. By the way of reason, that's one method. Ever more light may come to bear in that space, the interior architecture between our two ears. Clarity, until clarity abounds. Then we have all these words, right? The Greeks call that metanoia. In the East, we call that the enlightened one. Light, illumination. Salvation would be a Western word, I guess. Ultimately, what are we after? Well, it's what we in philosophy call wisdom. So you can have all this information in the world on the web. You can have all the intelligence in the world. In it all, where's the wisdom? And that's something ever more elusive the more we apparently progress as human beings through time, ever more elusive to understanding what that even is. But that's at the core of what makes us human. Some wisdom. I predict, quite humbly, that that's the stuff that's not going to spew out of artificial intelligence. Okay? You're viewing the phenomena, our human condition, merely from a quantitative point of view, in the stead of a qualitative one. An illustrative verbiage here is to say you're living, your apprehension of humanity is entirely on a plane. And you can move and fight over there to that corner of the plane, and that's where people have golden gated communities and Rolex watches, and they're gonna die with the most toys, no doubt, and they can run around in their clubs, and yeah, look at them on the other side over there in that corner, them poor sods, and all of this stuff, and we're successful over here. But then there's the vertical. Then there's the vertical dimension to all of this. Okay? To become upright, to walk erect, which has much, much more meaning in it than being a bipedal. To become truly upright as a human being, and to not want to simply live one's life on a horizontal plane, copying, if you will, the success of a rat. Look at that rat. It has far more cheese bunkered away than all of them. Oh, that's a successful rat. Well, I want to be like that. When I was a young man, many, many decades ago, undergraduate course philosophy, Professor Larry Moore R. Nickel, God bless him, one of a handful of mentors in my lifetime. Hardly a week ever gone by in the semester where he wouldn't just turn around in front of the whole class and yell out loud, "The only being that can be truly successful in a rat race is a rat. So, Warren, tell us, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And the whole class erupted in laughter, people falling from their chairs, pointing fingers at me. Great teacher. Sure got me at some point to start thinking about that. What do I want to be when I grow up? The only being that can be truly successful in a rat race is a rat. So how about it? What do you want to be? This vertical dimension, the qualitative, has to do with values. And they are correlative of meaning. They allow, in this journey, which sometimes is called spirituality, if you will, but that's a slippery word. We should talk about that when we talk about truth, and confusion. That's a slippery word. We should get back to that here right away. But this vertical level, the more you ascend into being amazed. I asked you once, what does it mean to be a theist, Alex?
It means to believe that God exists,
What does it mean to be an atheist?
that you believe that God does not exist.
Yeah, it negates. A is the ancient prefix of negation. So what do you think it means to be amazed?
Not lost, perhaps?
Yeah. Think of a plain like a cornfield where there's a maze. You walk around in there, it's trial and error, like, oh, dead end, I got to turn around. How do you find out of it? Well, imagine being lifted vertically up so you can see the maze. You can immediately see the way out. Oh, there's the way out. There, I won't be lost. I know exactly where to go. Now you have been amazed. Okay. Amazing grace. We can get back to that word one day. What is grace? It gets ever better when you unpack these things. You start understanding. I use all these words in my head, but I always use them to explain something in front of my eyeballs, instead of looking at the words I'm using to explain in and of themselves and popping the hood on them and realizing, wow, they actually mean something total. To be amazed, to be lifted out of a maze, so as to see clearly, to be illuminated, to no longer feel lost and confused, but Yeah, I can see the direction. I know where north is. So this vertical, at some point it allows for what the ancient Greeks would call stomen halos. It allows a human being to stand well, to stand well. And what are all the connections here? They're enormous. We should get into this. See, now we're in semantic space. This is my life, my field. Well, as in well-being. Oh, wow. The story at the well, wasn't there? This Jesus guy hooks up with a lady, talks about the well, well-being. To stand well, stand at the well. What does that mean? You know, Shakespeare speaks of this. Okay? To stand well. When the mighty winds of the tempestuous seas blows one hither and thither in life, and others scurry and run and scream and panic and sell out. There are those who may stand well, even in the face of great darkness. Why? Because they know. What do they know? They know who they are. They know who they are. They have vertically come to a greater understanding in a field of values. And it's inextricable from our human condition is values. It's inextricable in our human condition is values. Here we're bumping into this whole idea of free will and moral culpability and all the craziness in the 20th century. I mean, I've had dozens of occasions to visit in the 90s. I always went to many physics symposiums to study thermodynamics, Big Bang, just to get a grip on all this stuff. And I've heard on dozens of occasions physicists on stage in front of a room full of people claim that free will is just an illusion. See what I'm saying? Because, you know, in their subfield of a subfield of what is science, of course they think that is science, but it's a subfield of a subfield of what is science. In front of their eyeballs, what they can observe, measure, weigh, seems to be forevermore but a Newtonian universe. In other words, the first law of thermodynamics stands paramount. Another way of putting that is there are no magic atoms on the periodic table of elements. It seems that anything entered on the periodic table of elements only moves if it was first moved upon by something outside of itself, like a domino. And if all I am is what I can find on the periodic table of elements, then determinism is ineluctable. Then truly, free will is an illusion. Me deciding this over that right now was already determined from the moment of the Big Bang forward. Just a Google and more domino strings just falling on each other as the universe unfolds, no different than a domino, room of dominoes unfolding. Mm-hmm. And I've known many more physicists take that position as opposed to any other. And it's mind-boggling. It's just mind-boggling. And in many instances, I would get them to stutter in no time because it's a not well thought out position. Just imagine you come home and found your spouse in bed with the neighbor. Did that anger you?
Yes.
Why? Why? If it was determined from the Big Bang forward, it's not her fault. She can't help it no more than the domino has to fall when I hit it with a hammer. So why? Why? You going to sit here, I would tell physicists on stage back in the 90s, you going to sit here and tell me that you wouldn't be angered at all? Because if you are, why? I'll tell you why. Because you believe she could have chosen differently. That's why. You believe she's responsible for that choice. You believe she truly had a choice, not merely an illusion, as you just claimed. And to contour yourself in such pretzels of the human mind, to stand up in front of a room full of people and claim there is no such thing, it's just illusion. We call that progress in the world of science. I call that total regression. To me, it's pretty obvious that the ancients had far more wisdom than we do now. It seems we have ever less of it the further away we go from ancient times. Of course, we're morally culpable beings. No tribe, caveman tribe, no society has ever lived that did not reserve the right to have a tribunal of elders in the caveman times, or a court or a judge in today's time, to say to the one being charged of a crime, we believe you could and should have chosen differently, buddy. We believe you could and should have chosen differently. That's what we believe, and that's why you're going to be punished. That's why we're going to lock you up. That's why we're going to do this, that, or the other. That's why we're here. That's why we believe in rehabilitation. No society has ever existed that didn't reserve the right to believe that people have a choice about some, maybe not all, of course not all, but some of their behavior. Yeah, there's a deeper analysis here. We don't have to go into nerdland that far, but, if everything is free, every behavior, then we would be random beings. Stop it. I can't stop my hand. That's random. That would be total freedom. We don't want that. If you have total freedom, you could not have a person. In short, you could not have personality. That's whom you are, character-wise, that lives on through time. It modifies and changes, but through the river of time, there is a continuity. There's a continuity. I recognize Alex from 15 years ago in my classroom. I recognized him right away, opening his email 6 months ago. There's a continuity of personality. There's a person there. That would not be possible in total freedom. Okay. So freedom is somewhere in between total freedom, which is chaos, non-person, non-world, non-phenomenal world, for sure. And the other extreme, determinism. Complicated robot, but robot nonetheless, suffering from the illusion that they're free. It's somewhere in between. And there's a lot of misunderstandings going on about that. Okay, a lot of people, even very, very smart people, they haven't formally gone into the deep end of the pool in philosophy. There's a lot of confusion about what that is. I mean, clearly, we are determined, thank goodness, in many ways, or I couldn't be a person, by nurture and nature. Okay, genetic makeup and environmental conditioning. So clearly. Clearly, often we do suffer illusions. If we're naive, especially if we fall into naive realism and never climb out of all of that, like Plato's prisoner finally crawling out of that cave. I mean, surely, I live here in Wyoming. I live in very rural, Johnson County. Zero industry here. It's all sheep herding and cattle. Okay, that's Cowboy Central right here. Tough kids, tough kids. Kids around here, rite of passage, you turn 12, you ride a bull. Tough kids. Okay. You see them at the rodeo, break their leg and force themselves not to cry in front of dad and all their friends. Tough kids, tough people. My heart goes, I love it. It's just, I'm a little boy. I like tough people. See the little girls cry at the 4-H, the fair. You know, they got a pig who weighs 200 pounds and has a name, Daisy, and they cared for it for an entire year. They fed it, they petted. They were there holding its little foot when it was sick. They kissed it and smooched it, and they win first prize. Big picture on our local newspaper, and never fails. They're on the picture, they're just crying and crying and crying. Why are they crying? Huh? Tears of joy? No, no, no. Not tears of joy. No. Okay? There's an auction on those pigs. Generate money for good purposes. And the girl knows. Okay? The pig's heading to the slaughterhouse this afternoon after the event's over. That's it for the pig. Kids here know where food comes from. Something seemingly utterly lost in too many people in metropolitan urban areas of the modern world. That in and of itself causes an enormous value problem, responsibility problem, ultimately an enormous increase in unnecessary suffering in our human condition. People losing track of what is necessary in this life, and that there is necessary suffering in this life. That this here is what theologians of old mean by a fallen world. Yeah. Knowledge thereof. Surely if I take one of these cowboy boys here in Wyoming and I take him to Los Angeles or to San Diego on a vacation, and then he realizes all his shoes that were lost somehow, break in at the hotel, he's barefoot, we just come back from the beach, it's like, well, let's go to the mall, buy you some shoes. What do you think he's gonna buy?
Cowboy boots.
There you go. Is that a free will decision? Probably not. We're probably talking about environmental conditioning. He was disposed to that because, okay, take the same kid from South Central Chicago. What's he gonna buy? Probably some Jordan high tops, right? Was that a free will decision? No, probably not. I was born and raised in Bavaria, southern Germany, beer capital of the world. I'm keenly aware that had I been adopted out after 1 or 2 days after being born to a nice Japanese family and had grown up as an adopted kid, Warren, the adopted kid in Tokyo, well, if I had dinner and wanted an alcoholic beverage with it, I'd probably be disposed to ask for sake. And I hate sake. So if I have an alcoholic beverage, no surprise to me, I'm disposed to having a beer. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, non-alcoholic, decades ago, I decided, I don't want anything messing with my mind. Clarity, constant clarity. To police or govern myself. My base drives has become too important. As whatever little progress in my case has happened vertically is apprehended as real. And so I want to keep moving in that direction. So what is free will? And then there's all these very smart people. Physicists, biologists like to do this a lot. They have these nifty theories about free will. Going way down the rabbit holes of neurochemistry and evolutionary, selection deals, and all the way down. Brett and Heather, they Weinstein, they have one. They go, gosh, there are 6, 7 standard deviations down the bell curve in terms of nerdland and nitty gritty and deep into the pool of trying to somehow have some theory thereof. Not being formally trained in philosophy, they don't seem to understand that no matter how far down there they go, they're not escaping a Newtonian universe. You have not escaped the first law of thermodynamics. You can reword it, redefine it, nifty, 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 nifty. You're not getting out of it. You're not getting out of it. And so I will purport, just as a working idea, that free will is but our potential ability to participate in the formation of our volitional body. There, I've said it. Free will expresses itself in our potential ability to participate. In the development of our volitional body. Nature is determining it. Nurture is determining it. But we can also, with our rational mind, have determining influences to mix in there with it, so that over the passage of time, inclinations change. I am no longer inclined to want an alcoholic beverage at dinner. The end. When I decided to participate in the formation of my volitional body towards that end, it was apparent that there are many natural as well as nurtural dispositions, drives, impulses that said differently. And I had to say, no, I'm going to deny you. I'm going to deny you. We're into Plato's tripartite of the soul. The base drives, the spirited, emotional side of human beings, and the rational side. And he calls on us to have the rational side govern over the spirited and the base drives. That doesn't mean to deny them, but to discern where they should be given free rein and where they perhaps shouldn't, even though they would like to break out and do their thing. So to have some measure, some rhyme, some syntax, some proper composition, so that I may compose myself. So here we get into these things. What is knowledge? There's more here than merely the rational? What is knowledge? There's more here than merely what we find in the physical sciences. All of that is on a horizontal plane, and it's useful. It'll give me technology. It can give me riches and social status. Okay. But is that the ultimate goal? Is that the ultimate goal? See, the ultimate goal inevitably is going to have me say something that implies value, which points towards the vertical, but then I live my life only on the horizontal, making it hypercritical of all these non-physical sciences, fields that do offer us insight into the human soul, the human psyche, into what we call wisdom. Wisdom on the vertical can ultimately result in a person being at ease. It can do much, much more. Much, much more. But at a minimal level, it can result in a person coming to find an inner peace, to let go of bitterness, inner struggling, blame, to be at ease. What does that mean? It means to no longer be in dis-ease, to no longer be in dis-ease, but to come to be at ease, to no longer be diseased. Mm-hmm. The vertical inevitably is a therapeutic process. Religious people call it salvation. Call it whatever you want, it's a therapeutic thing. If I look at an evil man, a truly evil man, Ted Bundy, people running concentration camps, what do I care how intelligent they are? What does anyone care how intelligent they are? Does that play any role in my assessment of whether I like them or not? No, none at all. All of that's just a means to an end, which kind of foretells that knowledge or truth inherently has more to offer than building blocks on the horizontal. More technology, more convenience. One of the problems of the modern age here, apart from the nightmare of postmodernity, in my humble opinion, is that most of us here in the West, through consumerism, have been slowly spoon-fed for generations this ever greater willingness to trade truth for convenience, mere convenience. That in every little increment of convenience, that increment of merely being convenient doesn't in and of itself foretell some great evil or tragedy. But the habit of having our volitional body formed towards preferring convenience to truth puts us as a civilization into dire straits, as well as individuals into dire straits in terms of any development, in terms of value, in terms of wisdom, in terms of meaning, meaningfulness. Convenience, at times, it seems to me, the bane of our existence. Tell friends, loved ones, my family, for decades, Our biggest problem is we're doing too well or we're doing too good. Things are too easy. Okay? And human beings just have it too easy. They start having the wildest ideas, seemingly, sometimes at least, purely out of boredom. I'm so bored, let's go destroy the world. Why not? I mean, that sums up postmodernity right there, as far as I'm concerned. What are your thoughts here, Alex?
Well, that was quite a journey. I don't know, I think the scientific, the field of physics, has this, I think you call it, empiricism or naturalism or, maybe materialism as this viewpoint. Yeah, everything that exists is really, what we can see and prove with science. But there's clearly much more as you described in detail, and this kind of what has been placed at the pinnacle of knowledge and understanding, the physical sciences, as we discussed some today and in depth the last time, has really, that eliminates the idea of something outside of what we can see, and including wisdom. There's no place for wisdom either, and there's, like you said, we're in this horizontal plane in the physical sciences, and we can understand how physical objects and interact with each other. And we can live in that way. You described it as the man in Plato's cave, who just is kind of seeing these images, and I think kind of living, like a rat or, an animal, and not, I think, there's this call to transcendence, this vertical, beyond our animal, nature, let's say, which that's what it sounds like the physical scientists want to say. No, there's no difference. I mean, maybe there's some difference, but it's only that we can think through things. But, that's really where it ends, and then get into, you know, gymnastics trying to explain, free will. And I mean, yeah, this is so critical, that this view of all that exists is just physical reality. But when you ask, yeah, well, why are you upset about your wife, was cheating on you? Or, I mean, I think, to really relevant right today, we live in a culture that says truth, truth is opinions. But okay, well, now we have the Epstein files have come out, and our nation and Western civilization, up in arms. This is terrible. We can't accept having these people leading us, and it's well, I think it's important for people to realize you can't think, no, we're just animals and we don't really make decisions, and oh, it's terrible that they chose to do those things as you described it. And we definitely have that's a clear contradiction in views. And I think you've demonstrated well that free will does exist. And if it doesn't, then it's who, again, we go back to who cares? Why talk about it? Why would, and I see, you see people who are in this really scientific mindset that this is all there is what science can prove, and will be upset at someone who believes something differently. Well, they didn't have, in your view, they didn't even have a choice to believe something differently. They're just predestined to be like that. Why are you even arguing? Well, of course, because you don't even have a choice.
I'd like to
So,
interject. I'd like to just interject. I once wrote a book called The Clearing in the Wood. And in that book, oh,
yes, lovely book. And definitely talks about much of what we're discussing here can be found in here. I definitely
in that
recommend.
book, I write, when you're having a discussion or conversation with someone, and they get angry at you for forwarding your argument or whatever, then that's a sure tell sign that they're being dishonest from the get-go. Because you just said, some people get upset when you talk about free will or something. There's something wrong in there to get to from the get-go. Why get upset? I can just disagree with someone without having to get upset. We find this a lot in the whole postmodern crowd. They seem to be upset all the time about everything. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Alex.
Yeah. Oh, no problem. Yeah, it's a great point. And yeah, so I think, connecting this kind of all back together and trying to kind of tie a trail through this conversation, it's the physical science, and then there's this something beyond just that. And I think, knowledge, and, we've talked about potentially pursuing intelligence. And, I think you made a good case that intelligence isn't the pinnacle of achievement, or, there's really no reason to place that as the highest value, potentially. And when we do that, Hitler, like you gave an example, was very intelligent. So, intelligence isn't the same as goodness. And I think now, but in contrast, wisdom, takes us out of this horizontal and brings us into this vertical plane, and allows us to see, instead of just being an animal who's fighting for survival, is basic and responding to these internal drives, and maybe even, in responding, you might even be, not quite the right word. It depends. Are we just reacting, and it's just chemical reactions? And I think we can, as humans, to some degree, it's possible to live in that way, just like an animal would, and you're just following your animal instincts, as they would say. But I think, this call to transcend that, and I think it's, for, I would say, in my mind, the vast majority of people could understand that we and feel that calling, that, we don't want to just be in a rat race. We don't want to just be here and do this and make enough money to survive, and maybe we retire and then we can vacation for 10 years at the end of our life and feel comfortable. And yeah, and this idea of convenience, I'd be curious to know, do you know what the etymology of convenience is?
Yes. For con is with. It's from the Latin, the ancient Greek, all the way back to the Proto-Indo-European. Con, chili con carne, chili with meat. Okay. Aqua con gas, water with bubbles in it. Okay. And then venience is derived from the word venial.
It's like related to veins, right? Is that right? Or
Well, you're going to find the word predominantly in Western civilization in theology. Venial sin. Venial sins. And yeah, look it up. Venial. It's the lowliest, the fleshiest.
okay. So you could infer really from that, living with convenience as your guiding value is really what I was describing, this living like an animal, just living from your
Yeah,
fleshly
yeah.
desires.
To live a
And
venial life means having turned your back wholesale on what Aristotle would call character development, becoming
yeah,
a better human being.
yeah. So clearly part of that's not just doing what's easy. I mean, there's an interesting juxtaposition here I want to explore a little. You talked about, being at ease and as opposed to being diseased, free from sickness, essentially. And maybe ease, and convenience, they kind of, at least in my mind, in our culture, seem to be very much a similar, almost synonymous words. What do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm hitting the etymology dictionary now for the both of us. indulgence, desire, strive for, sexual love, venial.
Mm-hmm.
It also implies sins that typically are viewed as, by the person committing them, as being able to overlook them. They're small sins instead of big ones, like murder. So we have these incremental things of, incrementally being disposed ever more to trade truth for convenience.
Mm-hmm. And then I looked up ease in etymology. It's maybe more related to like a peace of mind and not like a satisfaction of your, you know, bodily, your fleshly impulses. Maybe is one way to distinguish.
Correct. Correct. Being at ease. This is on the vertical. It's something that trumps. You can be at ease totally, like I am when I fast. Like I haven't had food since Thursday. Today is Saturday. I've had 0 calories. So I went to bed hungry. My stomach even growled. But I was utterly at ease. If I'm not at ease, then being hungry and my stomach growling is experienced as primary suffering. It's something that takes the field as my primary self-awareness, like, oh, I gotta remedy this. Let me go grab something to eat.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm at ease, then that suffering or pain in the stomach is just as loud, but it cannot pierce me. It cannot hurt me.
Mm-hmm.
It cannot thrust itself into me. It cannot wound me when I'm at ease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think another word that I don't know that we probably said it at some point today, but the word comfort is a word that I find interesting. 'Cause I know the etymology of that a little bit. Really the word means to strengthen, like fortify, fortress. But um, in our society, I think that's word has become, again synonymous with convenience when perhaps it means something
Yes,
much different
yes,
in kind of the vein of
yes.
this discussion
Very
here.
good. See, these are things we can talk about going forward. The whole deconstruction of language that inevitably happens. And then the mind-boggling emergence of brand new languages. Like in the 6th century AD, English just emerged on the Britannian island over the course of 1 or 2 generations. It just emerged as a common language, a new language. It's like, how did that happen? I mean, these people didn't even have deodorant. I mean, they didn't sit around at the campfire deciding on declination tables, what's one side down the other. I mean, how does that happen that a new language just emerges and everybody understands it? We take so much for granted. There's profundity right there. How did that happen? If you study the emergence of English, it's like, boy, you're really stretching it trying to figure out things that make sense of how to explain that on a horizontal. I mean, it's like, so yeah, we words mean different things. My thesis work, I did a comparative cosmological and ritual behavior comparison between the Vedics of ancient India and the Zoroastrian religion. And there's another word, I mean, Native Americans, native people the world over have usually, especially in antiquity, reserved the use of hallucinogenics or drugs in general for high ritual liturgical actions in their cosmological priesthood and so forth. Okay? You know, the Agni Kayana, the big, famous ritual of the ancient Vedics, you know, they would use ephedra from the Himalayan plains and a fly agrarius off of particular mushrooms to invoke, you know, states of invocation in their ritual chanting and so forth, the peace pipe of the Native Americans and peyote and usage like that. In their highest of liturgies, what is structural, meaning what many of them, most, have in common, is in their highest of all liturgical, once a year, all the priests come to do this huge ritual, is that they are ritualistically revisiting the beginning of the world. And that's where the word recreational drug use comes from. They're actually the ones who are involved in recreational drug use, which is, by the way, a very legitimate thing. It's very reserved. It's set aside into a sacred space. And to get there, in the training of these these people know what they're doing. Timothy Leary called set and setting, stuff like that, after having been to Nepal and looked at some of this stuff. How do we use that word today? Well, recreational drug use means a teenager who's bored on Saturday night, you know, popping hallucinogenics just to go to the discotheque because he's bored out of his mind. What does that have to do with recreational use? Nothing whatsoever. You see what I'm saying? And so we have this deconstruction of language that happens constantly, where words no longer mean what they originally meant. And that is also a source of slowly but ever increasing confusion. Here you have this neat story in the Bible of all, you know, in the Tower of Babel. I pronounce it Babel. It just makes more sense. I mean, what do little babies do when you don't understand them? They babble. And so that whole story speaks of man himself thinking he can reach heaven by his own power, building this tower, and until everybody working on the tower no longer understands everybody else. They're they're speaking the same language. They don't understand each other. They're no longer connecting. It's like, what do you mean by that? It doesn't make sense to me. They all start babbling, like a babbling little baby. I don't know what it's saying. They're all babbling to each other. Like common sense dude Warren here. I've lived in this country more than 40 years now, having been born and raised in Germany. And make no mistake, I've lived a very public life, right? I've never once personally, in person, met a white supremacist or a Nazi yet in the great United States of America. Yet I've met thousands of people, administrators, presidents of universities, who unmistakably claim that, and everybody, keep in mind, there's a white supremacist or a Nazi hiding behind every blade of grass in America today. And I think to myself, what are they on about? I don't get it. I mean, last time I saw Nazis, I was 14 years old in Bamberg, Germany. And there was a march of skinheads, wearing ironclad army boots and suspenders with baseball bats and bottles. They had to bring in riot police from Munich, from Nuremberg. And boy, let me tell you what, a lot of them cops were flown into the hospital. Marching down the street, Sieg Heil. And I was like, yeah, that was the last time I saw a real Nazi. I really don't get it. Where are all the Nazis hiding behind every blade of grass in America today? It's like we're speaking different languages. Mm-hmm. I have no clue what you're on about when they start talking like that. Heck,
Mm-hmm.
last I heard, everybody's a Nazi who disagrees on anything they're saying, and I don't even know what they're saying because it makes no sense to me. So you see what I'm saying? It's like, wow, isn't that eerily similar to that, what used to be a strange story, that Tower of Babel thing? It's like, oh, they just all of a sudden don't understand each other, even though they seem to be speaking the same language. It's like the people I'm speaking of, they speak English. I can make it out. It's English.
Mm-hmm.
But man, I've met tens of thousands of people here in America in the last 4 decades. I mean, I understand that there's some clowns somewhere in America yelling Sieg Heil in their clown outfits and all that. But I've never met one personally, so how can they be hiding behind every blade of grass, you know? So, you know, there's this breakup in language. But in closing, if I may, do we have 5 minutes?
Yes.
What I would like to leave you and your viewers with is something to consider, something to think about. Namely, given we know that anything I observe, measure in front of my eyeballs in the mesocosm conforms with a Newtonian universe, conforms with cause and effect, conforms with the first law of thermodynamics. Given I know that there are no magic atoms on the table of elements, any one of those elements doesn't just get up and move. Wow, look at that, an uncaused event. That atom just got up and moved all on its own. That doesn't happen. You see what I'm saying? They're all different shaped domino pieces. And if that's all I am, then everything I am conforms with the Newtonian universe. There is no free will. Then what does that mean? If I'm willing to wrap my mind around the idea that, yeah, actually, we do go through life believing that people, in one way or another, to one measure of another, are responsible for some of their actions. There is some sense of a free will operative in our human condition. If I'm willing to say yes to that, then what does that mean? Here's what it means, and this will tie back into the beginning of today's conversation. It means that wherever I truly believe and have reason to believe I could have chosen differently, okay? That experience of having chosen that is what, properly speaking, is a spiritual experience. There it is, that word spiritual. Okay? It's been cornered so terribly in the last 150 years. I remember speaking years ago to an Eastern Orthodox priest. And in this conversation, because he wanted to speak, he wanted to explore with me some philosophical thoughts, how they made parallel theology. But he was very, very skeptical of philosophy, which is something you ubiquitously will find in Eastern Orthodoxy. To my mind, well, I am a philosopher, so to my mind, it's a lot of misunderstandings that's causing that. But anyway, I said, well, why don't we, talk about spiritual experiences? Because we were just always talking and talking, and it was like a surface level. And it became quite platitudinal. And he kept ever more platitudes and thinking that we're going somewhere. And, to me, a bolt, nut, gravy kind of guy in philosophy is like, no, we're not really going anywhere. It's platitudinal. So let's talk about spiritual experiences. He immediately said, no. I said, why not? And then he quoted sternly several saints and stuff at the church, the history, that we ought not talk about such things ever, unless we are on our deathbed or in the confessional with a priest. As that can lead into all kinds of delusion, misteachings, it's very dogmatic kind of approach to church. And there was no retort to that. And somehow it ended right there, a big no. And I realized without being able to convey this, because this person became one of the people that turned around and went away. Remember, there's flight or fight people.
Mm-hmm.
I have left that conversation concluding that he must be thinking of the meaning of spiritual experience in this narrow sliver of what it really is. Namely, I guess he meant me confessing to him that the skies opening and angels on clouds appearing, and he never allowed me to say, Father, do you believe in free will and that we're morally responsible for our actions? Yes, then you believe that in spiritual experiences. That's what that is. Why do I say that? Because it's not contained on, nor can it ever be explained with, whatever you enter on or whatever is found on the periodic table of elements. There it is. Okay. So you're mad at your wife because she's sleeping with the neighbor? You're having a spiritual experience. Why? Because you believe with all your heart you could have chosen differently. You believe in something spiritual that can never be captured by physics, the physical. It's that simple. And we've completely lost that. We've lost the plot on that one, what spiritual even is. Mm-hmm. Okay? We've just forced it into a caricature of, get out of here. You must be an imbecile, an idiot to mention spiritual anything. I'm a serious human being, so when I hear the word spiritual, I have learned to recoil. That's a malformed humanity that does that. That's just, again, a part of that is the deconstruction of language, but there's more going on there. Because clearly, just this idea of moral culpability implies the belief in human spirituality. So think about that. Now, I'll just leave some open questions for you. A lot of thinkers in the past, most famously René Descartes, bless him, believed that meant that metaphysically we are in a dualism. There's two kinds of ultimate substances. One is spiritual, the other physical. Okay? Well, that would mean if I ever did a free will decision and acted on it, that somehow atoms in my brain started moving as if pushed by a ghost. We know that that doesn't happen, Alex. If I open up a brain and look, well, then I put that brain in front of my eyeballs. Everything there in front of my eyeballs will always conform with the Newtonian universe. You're not going to get away from it. Okay? So last time we spoke, I exclaimed in passing that, no, it's not a dualism. It was when we spoke of Aristotle and Plato disagreeing with the atomistic school of philosophy founded by Leucippus and Democritus. They were monists. Only atoms exist. Of course, they were smart enough then to say there is no free will. This discussion happened already 2,500 years ago. Aristotle, scoffed at the whole idea and said, wow, that misses the whole point of being human. They probably had the same conversation we had here today, Alex. And so I said that Aristotle and Plato are dualists. They believe there's two different ultimate kind of substances that make up our human condition. One is physical, the other spiritual. Okay? But they didn't have it down yet that leads to the problem of interaction. How does a ghost push the atom? So here we find this stuff that is skipped over in pop culture and no one notices it. Like when I was an undergraduate back in the late 80s, I was a big Star Trek fan, The Next Generation. And on this one, Captain Picard, you know that? And on this one show on Star Trek, in Star Trek, they were invaded by some alien that had a spiritual nature, and like a ghost was able to come onto their ship and wreak havoc. And you could see it, but only like as an abstract, weird shape, right? And they were trying to catch it because it'd mess with their motors and stuff. And then they'd open the door and they'd go, there it is. And it would see them. You could kind of look through it, sort of transparent, but you'd see it. And it would run over there and just jump through a wall into the next room. And they're like, oh, they have to get out of the room, walk to the other room. And I then, a young budding psychology, philosophy student, I was like, oh, Gene. Gene Roddenberry, he wrote the show. I'm like, what have you done? Why can he just jump through the wall, but when he's running to the wall, his feet bounce off the floor? See, now you're doing philosophical thinking, right? Why wouldn't he just fall through the floor if he's a spiritual being? Because he can move through matter. Well, then it doesn't matter whether it's a wall or a floor. So here his feet get to touch and bounce off the floor, but there they swoosh right through the atoms. What's that? That's called a contradiction. Of course, if you're not a philosophy nerd, you'd never... And you're not supposed to notice this. You're supposed to enjoy the show and all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. So I said they're dualists. Anyway, I made the comment in passing that we know that that's not the case. Dualism is not it. We are in a monism. We are in a monism. There's only one substance that makes up the phenomenon. Okay? So what does that then mean? If I demand to speak of the spiritual, but then there's also the table of elements that is physical, and they're not two different things. Well, there's two ways to go about this. One is we can just be honest and say, I don't know, that remains a mystery. Free will remains a mystery, but I do believe we're responsible, morally culpable. The vertical is real, and I'm heading up. And I do believe you're being disingenuous, Professor so-and-so, if you tell me that you don't believe there is any free will, because I'm convinced you'd be really mad at your wife. You come home and she's sleeping with the neighbor. And there's only one reason you'd be mad, it's because you believe in free will. All of a sudden you're no different than that student in my classroom saying, well, everybody has their own truth, but 5 minutes ago, eating the sandwich you're having in my classroom, you really gave that vendor hell for giving you the wrong change. Forcing your truth onto him as to how much was missing, mathematically speaking. That prof is doing the same thing. You know exactly well, he'd be mad. You're human, just like me. Let's be honest. Instead of just trying to embody the pinnacle of knowledge and I'm the authority. I mean, come on, let go of it. We're all in this together. Let's just be human. Let's say it how it is. So we can say, I don't know, it's a mystery. But it has already, in so saying, opened the door to theology, to poetry, to art, to all these fields having an equal place and coming to bear on what is real in our human condition. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
To be a smart man, you don't need to just study physics. You can be a smart man and study theology and religions as well. And it can enrich your life just as much. Yeah, we're all in this together. It's not just, oh, I'm the monopoly, the big cheese. Or there is another way of explaining it altogether and being able to explain it. That's a very interesting one that is found like in philosophers like Bishop Berkeley and Immanuel Kant, all the way through the American transcendental tradition, Ralph Waldo Emerson, up and through the great William James. And these are things maybe we also want to explore, where you can come to understand, like, wow, we can explain that mystery. We can. What appears to be initially a mystery, namely that of us being creatures of free will, which I would never attribute to an animal.
Mm-hmm.
So something to think about. Just the word spiritual has a meaning, this wide, instead of only that sliver of it where the heavens opened and angels are flying around. Okay? It's actually a normal word. And we've somehow habituated our culture into scoffing at it right out of the gate, which really just exposes one's ignorance. Of having applied or experienced any kind of depth in thinking about these things.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, Alex. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
You as well, Warren. Really appreciate your time, and I really look forward to meeting you next time and taking this journey to the next level, and hopefully continuing to amaze myself and our audience, and give us some more clarity and understanding of where we are, who we are, what truth is, what our purpose is, meaning is, what the implications of free will are, and all these exciting topics. So thank you so much, Warren, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.